This episode is brought to you by America's Christian Credit Union, where your money grows and your values thrive. Obviously, as a neurosurgeon, you were performing some pretty intricate procedures, and you were making some observation about the brain and the mind and language and reasoning. Were there some things that you were seeing in the operating room that were causing you also to ask some bigger questions about whether or not science was fully explanatory, or at least a reductionistic view was sufficient to explain what you were observing in the OR?
Yes, this, in some sense, all these lines of thought were going on at the same time. When I was a medical student, as I had mentioned, I was in love with neuroscience and really felt that I could understand what it is to be human by understanding the brain in detail. When I got out into practice and began doing surgery and saw a lot of things happen with people in the operating room, before and after, I saw things that really didn't fit the textbooks at all. The textbooks generally describe the brain as if it were a computer. There's all these interconnections between neurons. It's extraordinarily complex. Virtually all the modern theories of how consciousness happens, it depends upon this notion of processing inside the brain. And I began to see patients of mine who had brains that were extremely deficient. I mean, major parts of the brain's missing, who were perfectly okay. They're perfectly fine. One of the most dramatic ones, and I think there's a picture of this child's MRI in the book, is a baby who was born missing about 2/3 of her brain. I followed her through her childhood, and as she grew up, she's now in her 20s. And at every stage of her life, she was perfectly normal. I had counseled her parents early on, that we couldn't be too optimistic. I mean, she probably would have some very severe handicaps, and she never had any handicap. She's just a bright young woman, excelled in school, and her mother jokes with me that she's actually too smart. I had another kid who was born with a condition called hydranencephaly, which I think is a very important condition for understanding how consciousness works. Hydranencephaly is a terrible birth defect where a child is born without brain hemispheres. So the only thing they have is their brainstem. Probably 80 or 90% of their brain is missing. This little boy, and it's rare, but it does happen. There are thousands of people in the world with hydranencephaly. This little boy was quite handicapped. He had very severe cerebral palsy, but he was perfectly conscious. He'd smiled, he'd laughed. He was happy to see his family. He didn't like to have medical procedures done. I mean, he was a perfectly conscious person with all the brain hemispheres completely missing. And everything in my textbooks when I was a medical student said that consciousness is from like computational processing in the cortex or the hemispheres of the brain. He didn't have a cortex or hemispheres. And he was quite conscious. So all of this really got me to thinking, so what does the brain do? Like, how does that work? And I began reading some of the work of a famous neurosurgeon named Wilder Penfield, who was one of the pioneers in neurosurgery. And he was a great scientist and a great neurosurgeon, worked in Montreal back in the mid-20th century. And he began, as I did, as an atheist and as a materialist. And he started out with a question in his scientific career, which kind of became my question. And the question was, does the brain explain the mind completely? That is, can you understand what the mind is all about just by knowing what the brain is all about? And initially he thought the answer would be yes. So he spent his life studying the brain. He was a great neuroscientist. And he did a number of different things. He studied epilepsy in great detail, and we can talk about what he found there. He also did 1,100 awake craniotomies. And what awake craniotomies are, and they're still done today, is there are times when the surgeon has to explore the brain in terms of stimulating it to find out what parts of the brain are doing what things in order to protect them during the surgery. And Penfield did 1,100 of these operations and made some amazing discoveries about what the brain actually does and what the brain doesn't do. So at the end of his career, he reflected on this question: does the brain explain the mind completely? In a book that he wrote that's still available on Amazon. It's called Mystery of the Mind. It's a great book. And he said that no, the brain doesn't explain the mind completely. There are aspects of the mind that don't come from the brain. The brain is in some sense necessary for their normal expression, but not all of the mind is from the brain. So I began to see things very, very differently and began kind of a systematic study of the mind-brain relationship. I looked at a lot of the great experiments in neuroscience over the past century and came to understand the mind and the soul in a very different way than I had when I was an atheist and when I was a materialist.
So when you were an atheist and materialist, before you embraced the possibility of a transcendent mind outside of this material universe, how were you curious of that question of why do things seem not to be adding up in terms of the story that I've been given, this naturalistic story that I've been given? It is not making sense. Was there a cognitive dissonance there? Was there a tension there that caused you to think, well, before you started doing all of your amazing investigative work there, was there something there that made you question, like, okay, things aren't adding up according to the textbooks, like you mentioned? Did you feel that sense of openness towards, okay, there's got to be a better or more full explanation for what I'm seeing here?
My feeling, quite candidly, was one of betrayal. That I came to see that scientists could be very biased people, could be very blind people, could even in some ways be kind of dumb, meaning that what I came to see in science is that many scientists are experts in a very narrow field, and their perspective on things outside of that field is often very, very inadequate. For just as a simple example, the cerebellum, which is a back part of the brain that's involved in many functions, including coordination. When you read the neuroscience textbooks, and there are entire massive textbooks written on the anatomy and physiology of the cerebellum, it's all this intricate computer-like thing that controls movements and so on. In neurosurgery, we can remove easily 80 or 90% of the cerebellum completely without any effect on the person whatsoever. There are people born with practically no cerebellar tissue who are perfectly normal people. And there are parts of the cerebellum that are very important that you can't damage. That's critical. But most of it you can remove, and we do it routinely. So I came to see that the scientists writing all these big textbooks, number one, they didn't know what they were talking about. They were so lost in their specialty that they didn't have the perspectives. And for example, most neuroscientists have never seen a living human brain. They've never seen brain surgery. They've never seen a person before and after they've had brain surgery. Most of them don't know anything about philosophy of mind, about all the philosophical questions that are raised that are very important about how the mind relates to the brain. So I came away from this with the idea that scientists really are often not that smart, that there's a lot of truth that goes far, far beyond what goes on in a materialistic science.
So that was awakening or piquing your curiosity for something more, perhaps a better explanation.
Yes.
So by the time that you and your wife started having children, and you were considering this is something qualitatively different than, complex neurons firing, giving me the emotion of love for my child, that there's, or even seeing or being awed at the wonder of creation, whether it's an ear or just, this amazing little baby that's in your hand. That was also, I guess, spurring you on towards thinking there may be something more. So it seemed like that there were a few things in your life that were causing you to sit back and wonder whether or not what you had believed was true, or whether indeed you were being betrayed by what you had been taught by authorities and by the presumed position
Right.
in science at the time.
Yes, yes. And I think the one takeaway that I got from that experience, and I also got very much involved in debates, in public debates about Darwinian evolution, because once I came to see that scientists had gotten the mind-brain relationship all wrong, I began to question other aspects of science, and obviously a very vulnerable aspect of science is Darwinian evolution, which I think is a bunch of nonsense. And I came to see that scientists were incredibly biased people, very, very often. Obviously, there are some who are not, but the scientific profession as a whole is kind of a guild. It protects itself, and it has a powerful materialistic bias, which really degrades the science and leads people astray. And I felt very much like I had been led astray, and so I became quite a critic of materialistic neuroscience and of materialistic and atheistic Darwinism.
Why do you suppose that there is such a strong bias? And I believe in your book you call it a methodological bias or an ideological bias, or materialistic bias, whatever you want to call it. What do you think informs that?
Well, the first point about that, to kind of put it in perspective, is that historically, there has been no relationship whatsoever between atheism and science. That is, that all the great scientists, literally all, I mean, that I know of, and there's been quite a bit of there's quite a literature on this. All the great scientists of the scientific enlightenment were passionately religious people. Most were passionately devout Christians. Christianity played an enormous role in the development of science. Copernicus, Newton. I mean, Newton wrote more about the Book of Daniel than he wrote about mathematics and physics. I think he was a passionate Christian, a little unorthodox in his own way, but he was passionately Christian. If you look at the work of James Clerk Maxwell, of Michael Faraday, who pioneered the understanding of electromagnetism, they were passionately Christian. These are people, their faith was the center of their life. Theoretical science, understanding the Big Bang, cosmology, physics, chemistry, that's almost entirely from the Christian West. So Christianity is the foundation of science, and atheism, particularly in the 20th century, it rose somewhat in the 19th century, but particularly in the 20th century, has moved into the scientific world and taken over parts of it. So atheism, I see atheism as kind of a foreign influence on science. And atheists have basically moved into the scientific profession and tried to get rid of Christians in the scientific profession, even though modern science is essentially a product of Christian theology and Christian philosophy. After all, why would you look for order and structure and purpose in the world if you didn't believe that it came from a rational mind, from God's mind? If you think that everything happened for no reason, why would you look for reasons? Why would you look at the natural that way? And the fact is that people who come from atheist cultures tend to look at the world that way, that there aren't reasons, things just happen. And it was Christianity that made us say, this came from a mind, and I want to explore how God's mind was instrumental in creating this world.
It's a bit ironic for me because the goal of science is to find answers and to be reasonable and to make sense of reality. And in your life, it looks like you were looking to make sense of reality. You were looking to make sense of what was going on with the mind that seemed different than the brain, or at least reduced to merely brain activity. You seemed to want to make sense of what was happening as you were having children, in this very human response. Walk us on from there in terms of how, you continue to be open, or it started to open you towards, again, other possible explanations for what you were seeing?
Well, I realized as I looked further into the neuroscience, into Wilder Penfield's work, into research on epilepsy and on awake brain surgery and my own experiences with that, research on split brain surgery, research on near-death experiences. There are all sorts of fascinating science there. I realized that the materialist bias in the scientific community was leading us astray. It was really betraying real science. And I also realized that you can't get away from philosophy. That is, that every endeavor in life, science is one good example, presupposes a philosophical framework, a way of understanding how the world works. And that scientists who claim, oh, no, we're just doing science, we're not doing philosophy, it's not true. What you're doing is materialism and atheism hidden in your science. So I really started to look at the philosophy in a much deeper way. And I read quite a bit of Aristotle and Plato, and I became very interested in Thomistic philosophy from St. Thomas Aquinas. And there's an author named Ed Feser, who's a philosopher in California, who's written a great deal on this, F-E-S-E-R, his last name, who gives a wonderful introduction to this way of looking at things. And I realized that particularly Thomistic philosophy, which is the cornerstone of a lot of Christian theology and philosophy, explains science in a beautiful way. He explains neuroscience. He worked in the 13th century, and his perspective on the mind-brain relationship is much, much closer to what we've discovered in modern neuroscience than any materialistic perspective. So I realized that you had to get the philosophy into this. You had to get your philosophy right. If you don't have the philosophical or metaphysical framework right, you can't get the science right.